calls for America to live up to its creed of freedom and equality. Its poetry is stunning, right up there with Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, and Maya Angelou. Our guest, Professor Banks, is a founding faculty member of the School of Educational Studies at the University of Washington, Bothell. She's a recipient of numerous awards, including, among others, the Distinguished Teaching Award from the University of Washington, Bothell in 1997, and most recently, the recipient of the 2021 Outstanding Community Service Award from Alpha Omicron Bolay. She has contributed to numerous renowned journals such as the Phi Delta Kappan, and has served on national and local boards, including Seattle Art Museum's Board of Trustees. She's editor and co-editor of several publications on teaching strategies and multi-educational education. And she's also a friend and associate of Leah Vaughn. Professor, thank you for joining us this evening. We're excited to hear from you on the topic of Lift Every Voice and Sing. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for that lovely introduction. I just begin by saying good evening to everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to have this opportunity to talk with the members of the Roosevelt Alumni Racial Equality, Equity group. I want to thank Leah Vaughn, because Leah was the person who invited me to speak to the group. I was not aware of the group until Leah introduced it to me. And then I want to thank Bruce Johnson, not only for a lovely introduction, but also along with Joe Hunter serving as the liaison for me to the group. So thank you for that support as well. Now tonight, my presentation is going to be on Lift Every Voice and Sing. It's a song that was written at the turn of the 20th century. And I'm going to be giving you kind of a historical overview of the song, its authors, and the context in which it was written. The song was penned actually in 1899 and sung for the first time in 1900. And this was at the height of segregation and lynching in the United States. And so you can tell that this was a particularly salient time in terms of the things that were happening to African Americans. The interesting thing about this song is that even though it was written actually in 1899, it still is relevant today as it was at that time. So 2022, a song written in 1899 still speaks to the heart and soul of many African Americans. Now, I want to begin the presentation by giving you a sense of what I'm talking about in terms of the song. Many of you are probably familiar with it, but even so, I just love hearing it. And so I think starting off with hearing it is a good thing. And I think that in hearing the song, and we're just going to hear that very first stanza, often when it's sung in meetings and various presentations, we sing the first stanza, but there are actually three stanzas. We'll hear all three eventually, but we're going to start listening to the very first stanza, and we're going to listen to Alicia Keys singing that stanza.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the glistening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song Facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Let us march on till victory is won. Let us march on till victory.
Such a powerful song, a very powerful song. I learned this song when I was actually a very young child, and I learned it sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table. And let me go back for another slide so that you can see a picture of my grandmother. She's on the right side of this slide. She gathered all of her grandchildren around her at her kitchen table, and she taught us the words to lift every voice and sing, because she knew that when we went to church, when we went to meetings, various activities, we would be singing that song. And so she wanted us to know the words to the song. Now, if you're interested in teaching your children or grandchildren lift every voice and sing, I've included some pictures of children's books on the left side of this slide so that you could just see the names of some books that are available for you to use with children to introduce them to the song if you're interested in that. I have very warm memories of this, singing it as a child growing up and also as an adult. And one of the things that I did is I taught the song to my children. I have two daughters, and I taught the song to both of them when they were children. And now I have two grandchildren, and my daughter taught the song to both of her grandchildren. Now, one of them is only 2, so she doesn't know the words, but she understands the importance of the song, and she hums and she tries to sing the words. The power of this song, I think, is such an important thing for us to take into account. You could tell from the video that there were elements that were a part of Alicia Keys' video that tied the song to things, current events that were going on. And it's a kind of song that is currently being embraced and sung by a wide range of celebrities, Beyonce, for example. It was also part of President Obama's inauguration in 2009, when Reverend Joseph Lowry recited the 3rd stanza of the song. And most recently, it's also been sung by Black Lives Matter activists, and it's been sung amid protests over racism and police brutality. So it's a song that is timeless in many ways. One of the things that I think we can also pay attention to is the way in which it has a political element associated with it as well. And so I wanted to just share with you that on January 13th, 2021, James Clyburn, who's a Democrat from South Carolina, introduced a bill in the US House of Representatives to make Lift Every Voice and Sing the national hymn of the United States. Representative Clyburn is the House Democratic Whip, and he's the highest ranking Black lawmaker in Congress. He said that the reason he wanted to introduce this bill was because he thought that the song could bring our nation together and heal our nation. Now, when you think about that, you think about the power of a song to heal a nation. You might be, wondering, how did a song which has penetrated so many aspects of Black life and have such power within the Black community come to be? And to fully understand the song, I think we need to know something about the people who wrote it and the times in which it was written. And so let's kind of take a step back and look at the people who were involved in writing the song. And that would be the Johnson brothers. James Walden Johnson, who's on the right side of this slide, wrote the lyrics to Lift Every Voice and Sing. And his brother, John Rosamond Johnson, who's on the left side of the photograph, composed the music. The brothers were born into a middle-class family in Jacksonville, Florida. James Weldon was born in 1871, and his brother, John Rosamond, was born in 1873. Now, let me tell you a little bit about their family. And I think this is important because, you know, when you think about the turn of the 20th century, you don't necessarily think about it in terms of the individuals who were living the life that the Johnson family was living. Their mother, Helen Louise Dillard, was born free in Nassau, Bahamas. She immigrated to the United States as a young girl. Her paternal lineage can be traced back to the late 18th century in Haiti. And her father, Stephen Dillard, served as a postmaster of Nassau. And he was one of the very few Black Bahamians who were able to secure a high status government job. And so it's important to understand who the parents were of the Johnson brothers, what their lineage was. And let's look at their father. Their father, James Johnson, is pictured on this slide, and he was a self-taught man. He spoke and read Spanish, as well as, of course, English, and he was also born free in Richmond, Virginia. And as a young man, he traveled to New York, where slavery had been abolished in 1827. He believed that New York would be a good place for him to seek his fortune, and so that's the reason he went there. And that's where he met Helen, and the two married in 1864. After they married, they left New York for Nassau. And the reason they left is because they feared that if the South won the Civil War, slavery might be reestablished in New York and their freedom could be lost. Now, after the Civil War, they moved to Jacksonville, Florida. Now, this slide gives you a view, just kind of a glimpse of what Jacksonville, Florida was like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. After the Johnson family moved to Jacksonville, their father secured a job as a head waiter in the St. James Hotel, which is pictured on the upper left side of this slide. And the interesting thing about that is that that was considered an excellent job, a really high status job for an African American. I remember my father talking about his father, who was a porter, train porter. And they were so proud that he had that position because it was something that allowed for him to travel, allowed for him to be in a kind of environment that gave them a level of status. And as you look at the slide, you can see that Jacksonville, Florida in the late 1800s, early 1900s was a complex place. So we have the Johnson family living a somewhat middle-class life, a father working at the St. James Hotel, considered probably one of the best hotels, certainly in the South, perhaps in the country. But then we also have a photograph of a family living on a plantation. And then in the lower right-hand corner, we see a local businessman. And there in Jacksonville, Florida, had a whole array of African Americans, some who were living very well and some who were struggling. The Johnsons wanted their children to be upstanding members of the community, and so they socialized them to be middle class. James Weldon and Rosamond were given music lessons at an early age, and Rosamond began playing the piano when he was 4 years old. At night, their mother read Charles Dickens novels to them, and they had a very cosmopolitan upbringing with trips to the Bahamas and to New York. Both brothers attended Stanton School all the way through the 8th grade, where their mother was a teacher. And the school was named after Edwin Stanton, who was an abolitionist and Secretary of War under President Abraham Lincoln. The first year that the school opened, it had 6 teachers and 348 students. You can see how hungry people were for education. Now, there wasn't a high school for African Americans in Jacksonville's, and like many African Americans who lived in the South, they had to leave town if they wanted to go to high school, and the Johnson brothers did exactly that. Now, this slide shows a picture of James Weldon and his classmates at Stanton. After he completed the 8th grade, James enrolled in Atlanta University, and he completed his high school diploma there and then continued on for college. In college, he learned Latin, Greek, studied public speaking, wrote poetry, joined the Glee Club, and enjoyed life as a college student. After graduating from Atlanta University, he returned to Jacksonville and taught at Stanton School and eventually became principal. And you can see a picture of him as the principal in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. The picture was taken during the time that he served as a person who was a visionary in terms of being a principal. He added the 9th and 10th grades to the school curriculum so that students would be able to stay in their homes longer before having to leave to complete their high school diploma. Later on, after some time, James studied law, and he did this through an apprenticeship with a local attorney. And he passed the Florida bar exam. He became one of the first African Americans admitted to the bar in Florida since Reconstruction ended. Now, Rosamond was also quite an accomplished young man. He and his classmates at Stanton are pictured on the left side of this slide. And Rosamond, who was considered a child prodigy, left Stanton after completing the 8th grade and went to the New England Conservatory in Boston. Now, the conservatory is pictured on the right side of the slide. He studied classical music there, and then he went on to London to study music there. And he later became the musical director of the Hammerstein Opera House. Rosamond eventually returned to the United States and served as a music teacher at the Florida Baptist Academy. Now, while working at Stanton, James Weldon wrote the words to Lift Every Voice and Sing. Now, this slide shows the students at Stanton who were among the very first to sing Lift Every Voice and Sing. James Weldon originally conceived the song as a poem. He thought that it would be wonderful to have a poem that could celebrate the birthday of Abraham Lincoln, which was on February 12th. However, once the poem was written, he realized that the words captured the drama, passion, and emotion of another person born in February. And that person was Frederick Douglass. Douglass had been born in slavery and didn't know his birthday, and so he chose February 14th as the day that he would celebrate his birthday. And like the narratives that Frederick Douglass wrote about in his journey from slavery to freedom, James Weldon's poem captured the story of African Americans in the United States in terms that were epic, wrenching, and thunderous. After talking with his brother, James Weldon, he decided that Rosamond would be a great person to compose the music for the poem. And they were able to do that. And the song was actually performed February 12th as part of the Stanton School exercises. Now, this slide shows a picture of 3 people whose lives were intertwined with Lift Every Voice and Sing. The song was created for Stanton students to sing at the school's Lincoln birthday celebration. The song included a special dedication to Booker T. Washington. And Washington, of course, was the preeminent, albeit controversial, Black leader at the turn of the century, and also the founder of Tuskegee Institute. The song proved to be bigger than an ode to any one leader or icon. It was a story reminiscent of Frederick Douglass's narrative about struggle, hope, and perseverance. It was a story about African Americans through the ages. It mourned the dashed dreams of Blacks and heralded their ability to dream anew. It was also important to note that when the Johnsons wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing, they wrote Black history and Black people into the tradition of formal Western music. And this was something that was unique. Now, I want to give you a little bit of context in terms of when the song was written. And to do that, I'm going to go to historian Rayford Logan, and he's pictured on this slide. He described the time when Lift Every Voice and Sing, the time in which it was written, as a nadir of American race relations. He wrote, quote, "At the turn of the century, it seemed that they, African Americans, might become a caste," end quote. Logan used the term nadir to describe the time when Lift Every Voice and Sing was written because it was a time when the promise of Reconstruction had been broken, Black codes had been enacted, and Jim Crow was rampant. When Reconstruction ended, African Americans were, for example, barred from or restricted from riding in train cars, eating in certain establishments, and participating in government. Moreover, between 1882 and 1902, over 2,000 African Americans were lynched. State constitutions were rewritten with explicit and bold language asserting their commitment to white supremacy. And so Logan used this term nadir to capture the way in which African Americans were being subjugated. He put a spotlight on race relations, and he was able to do this because of his credentials. He had studied with Carter G. Woodson. He worked with W.E.B. Du Bois. He had earned his PhD from Harvard University in 1936. He taught at Howard from 1938 to 1965 and was the former general president of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity that Martin Luther King also belonged to at a later date. So it was important to be able to capture the idea of the times. And Logan did a beautiful job of writing about it. Now, this period that Logan described as a nadir of race relations has to be tempered a bit, because it wasn't simply a time of exclusion and racial violence. It was also a time of blossoming. Blacks turned inward in response to Jim Crow, and they organized. This slide illustrates some of the results of the blossoming that occurred at that time in the African American community. Black schools, from elementary schools to colleges, were open across the country. Black religious, political, and civic organizations were also on the move. And throughout the country, Black associations like fraternities, sororities, teacher organizations were all involved in a struggle for civil rights. And this slide just has a little bit of information on it that gives you a sense of, what was going on that included the blossoming that was occurring across the country with respect to African Americans. One of the signs of the blossoming was the Black press. During the last 35 years of the 19th century, 1,200 Black newspapers were founded. And James Weldon joined that effort when he founded the Daily American newspaper in Jacksonville, Florida. In addition to newspapers, it was also a time when musicians were pursuing formal training and publishing their compositions and applying notations to traditional folk tunes. And this is one of the things that Roseman was doing. Black writers were publishing novels, essays, short stories, and plays, and activists were engaged in racial uplift. Hence, the nadir can be remembered as a time not simply of exclusion and racist violence, but also a time of blossoming. The Johnson brothers captured that element of the African American experience in Lift Every Voice and Sing with the words, quote, "Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won, end quote. Those and other words in Lift Every Voice and Sing resonate with all of the people who hear this song. It particularly resonated with the people of Jacksonville. It was especially popular with the young people, and it was sung in schools, churches, and civic gatherings. However, neither James nor Rosamond remained in Jacksonville long enough to witness the growing popularity of their song. At the time that they penned Lift Every Voice and Sing, Jacksonville was the largest city in Florida. It had a population of about 28,000, a little over 28,000 people, and Blacks comprised just over 16,000 people, or over half of the population of the city. James Weldon and Rosamond left Jacksonville and went to New York and settled in Harlem after a fire started in a mattress factory and then spread to a district where Blacks lived. The fire destroyed the Black neighborhood that Blacks had created and left 10,000 Black people homeless. The photographs on this slide show the impact of the fire on the African American community. After the fire, Lift Every Voice and Sing served as a song of endurance, lament, and supplication. It suited the moment for African Americans in Jacksonville as they gradually put their lives back together and rebuilt their community. As the song was growing in popularity in Jacksonville, it was also growing in popularity throughout the country. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was one of the reasons that the song grew in popularity. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was one of the most important Black organizations of this period. And it circulated the song and encouraged its members to embrace it. Victoria Matthews, who's pictured on the left side of this slide, was one of the founders of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And she played a key role in making Lift Every Voice and Sing a national anthem for African Americans. And she was born a slave in Fort Valley, Georgia. And at the end of the Civil War, her mother, who had escaped slavery, returned to Georgia to find Victoria and her sister. And she found them and took them back to New York. As an adult, under the tutelage of Ida B. Wells, Victoria became an anti-lynching activist and the president of the Women's Loyal Union, an organization that compiled data about the status of Black women nationwide. And they did this by sending questionnaires to Black ministers, teachers, and other community leaders across the country. Their goal was to correct the common misperceptions about race, as well as to aggregate information that they thought could facilitate collective efforts to develop the skills and resources among the Black population. Victoria wrote an article on the Johnson brothers for Colored America, and Colored America was the first monthly magazine in the United States that was exclusively devoted to African American culture. Now, in this article, Victoria referred to Lift Every Voice and Sing as an anthem. She went on to write, quote, "The music is endearing. It soothes as it inspires, like the real heart songs of our mothers. It affects the singer as deeply as the listener. It's like a plaintive melody that lingers and lingers, like a subdued memory pictured long after the sounds have rolled away." I love what she said because I totally agree with it, and I feel exactly the same way when I hear the song. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs published the lyrics to Lift Every Voice and Sing in a newsletter, and that newsletter was titled National Notes. And then they encouraged people to sing it at gatherings at their state and national organizations meetings. And in the early years of the 20th century, it became something that was expected to be sung. The women who were members of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs were teachers, social workers, church matrons, community activists, and civic association members. They were also mothers, daughters, wives, aunts, and cousins. And so when they asserted the sanctity of lift every voice and sing, it was assured that it would become fully embraced in the African American community. With their endorsement, the lyrics were published in newspapers and other publications throughout the country. Now, in the decades that followed, there was a slow but steady proliferation of lift every voice and sing in various segments of Black life and culture. This slide shows people gathered to celebrate their freedom. In 1903, Lift Every Voice and Sing concluded the Emancipation Day program of the Negro Literary and History Society of Atlanta. And that meeting was held at Ebenezer Baptist Church. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Emancipation Day became one of the most important occasions in the African American community, and Lift Every Voice and Sing was a ritualistic part of the celebration. By 1905, Lift Every Voice and Sing was also being sung as part of graduation programs, and it was embraced by major organizations like the NAACP. And the lyrics were published in The Crisis, which was the official publication of the NAACP. Interestingly, James Weldon was an active member and administrator in the NAACP, and he was instrumental in the growth of the organization. In 1916, he became the association's first field secretary, and he was responsible for the formation of new branches throughout the country. And while traveling in the South, he recruited a young man from Atlanta named Walter White. And those of you who know something about the NAACP know that White, who's pictured in the upper left corner of the slide, later became one of the association's most important leaders. Now, during his time at the NAACP, James worked with W. Du Bois and was actively involved in anti-lynching activities, including the Negro Silent Protest Parade, also pictured on this slide in the lower left side, and the publication of 30 Years of Lynching. He also worked to enact the Dyer Bill, which would have made lynching a federal crime. It was not enacted, however. With the endorsement of the NAACP, Lift Every Voice and Sing was widely embraced, and became known as the Negro National Anthem. Now, our knowledge of James Weldon Johnson and Rosamond Johnson is generally focused on Lift Every Voice and Sing. However, the Johnson brothers lived very active and full family lives. In 1910, James married Grace Nail, and she's pictured on the left side of the slide. And Rosamond married Norma Ethel Floyd in 1913. Norma is pictured on the right side of the slide. The brothers, along with their wives, were actively involved in the African American community in Harlem. And they've been described as Renaissance men of the Harlem Renaissance. James and Rosamond collaborated on a number of important publications, including the Book of American Negro Spirituals and a second book of Negro Spirituals, which were published as two separate volumes, one in 1925 and the second one in 1926. Both James Walden and Rosamond lived very rich and full lives, and I just want to share some additional information about them. James Weldon was widely known and respected as a poet and a writer. While in New York, he wrote a classic book titled Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, and the cover of that book is pictured in the upper left side of the slide. And if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. It's still available, still in print today. He also served as a diplomat, and after joining the Colored Republican Club in New York, he worked on Theodore Roosevelt's presidential campaign. And as a result of that work, he earned a consulate post in Venezuela. His career as a diplomat lasted 8 years, and during that time, he had posts in Venezuela and Nicaragua. His lifelong commitment to racial uplift is captured in the quote in the center of the slide. And there he says, Every race and every nation should be judged by the best that it has been able to produce and not the worst. And James Walden worked his entire life in a way that would enable him to be viewed as representing the best. His life came to an end when he was killed in an automobile accident while vacationing in Maine at the age of 67. Now, like his brother, John Rosamond Johnson, he was also a race man. He lived a rich, full life with many contributions. He was a prolific songwriter and singer. He established new directions in both music and theater, and they reflected his passion for musical comedy and his classical training in opera. He partnered with Bob Cole, and together they wrote a whole string of hits under the name Johnson and Cole. The sheet music covers for some of their hits are pictured on this slide. Rosamond and his wife Nora worked together at a music school in Harlem known as the New York Music School Settlement for Colored People. Johnson served as the head teacher there, and he died of a heart condition in New York on November 11, 1954, at the age of 81. Now, Lift Every Voice and Sing has been at the forefront of Black culture for many, many years. As African Americans organized, mourned, challenged, celebrated, for over a century, it has been a part of their lives. Now, filled with political imagination, the song leads listeners and singers on a procession toward liberation. There are 3 stanzas in Lift Every Voice and Sing, and they've often been described as first opening with praise, moving then secondly to lament, and then closing with a 3rd stanza of prayer. Within each stanza, the words move between the past, the present, and future possibilities. Now, I'm going to close this presentation by having us listen to all 3 stanzas of Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Lift every voice and sing till the ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Star is fast.
You know, if we think about this song, which was written over 120 years ago, it's amazing to note that it continues to stir the hearts and minds of African Americans, even until today. We remain committed to marching on till victory is won. Thank you. And if we have time, I'd be happy to take questions.
You mentioned when the lynching bill was proposed, I forget what year you mentioned, and I'm thinking that maybe that just finally passed.
I don't know if it actually passed. I know that it was up again, and perhaps it did actually pass, but it is interesting, isn't it? That,
What year was it proposed?
I think it was in the early 1900s, and I don't have that actual year right in front of me right now. But the idea that we could, have concerns about anti-lynching and not respond.
The House actually passed it last week, and it now goes on to
Okay.
the Senate.
Goes on to the Senate now.
Mhm.
And that's where it, has run into problems in the past. So we'll see. Hopefully it will pass the Senate.
Do we want to post questions in the chat or just do this orally?
Why don't we just do it orally? Just if anyone has a question, they can just raise their hand, Bruce, if that's okay.
That's fine. That's great. No, I think it's really great. I haven't heard whether Clybourne's bill, things pass the House, but usually die in the Senate.
It has not got moved forward.
Okay. Well, it should. I know our senators will vote for it.
Nancy, do you have a question?
I do. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
I have just adored this song since I first heard it in a church service a number of years ago. I went through a period where I was trying to memorize the lyrics and I would walk around singing it, and I just loved it. And then I started to wonder about, for me as a white person, the difference between appreciation and appropriation. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, that's always a tricky kind of thing. And you'll get different responses depending on, the experiences, biographical journeys that people have followed. My feeling is that this is a song, as Claiborne suggests, can be a song that could be a hymn for the United States of America, for the people of the United States of America. And it's a song about healing. It's a song about moving forward. And so I don't see this as individuals who are not African American embracing it and singing it as appropriation. I suppose if one wanted to take it and turn it into something that it wasn't, then perhaps that could be interpreted as appropriation. But to recognize the importance of the song in the African American community and to embrace that in a way that's respectful and appreciative of the work that the Johnson brothers did in creating it, and then all of the people that I talked about in terms of holding it forward so that we would have it today and be able to embrace it today. I don't consider that an inappropriate thing. And so I encourage you to continue singing it.
See here, what I need to do, I need to do that.
Nancy, do you have a question?
Yeah, and maybe this is related to the other Nancy's question, but I think the first time I heard Lift Every Voice and Sing was at a gathering at Greenwood Elementary in Seattle many years ago when some surviving members of the Tuskegee Airmen were visiting and being honored. And the song was sung, and I saved the brochure, and I hadn't heard the song before. And I do remember thinking, why is this song not our national anthem? Because of everything that it celebrates. But I do wonder, I don't know if there's ever been sort of a movement to replace the Star Spangled Banner that glorifies war with this beautiful song. But again, as the other Nancy said, I don't know whether that would be somehow, how shall I say, taking away from the experience of African Americans. But I can say, having worked in elementary schools, that this song is taught by music teachers and sung by children, certainly in Seattle public schools. But I don't know if it's explored properly for sort of attribution. Anyway, I'm just kind of wondering about the idea that this is such a more fitting national anthem, but whether it would, like the other Nancy said, take away, take some of the meaning away, I guess.
Well, again, I think that people are going to have different responses, and I can just give you my response. I think Clyburn was suggesting that it be a national hymn. And so it wouldn't take away from anything that we currently have. It would be in addition to. And I think thinking of it as a hymn gives it a kind of quality that allows for us to see it in the historical context in which it was written, and then in the way in which people are embracing it, African Americans are embracing it today, to give them strength and a sense of hope as they continue to work toward making this a more perfect union and enabling us to do what we say that America is. As the great poet once said, America's never been, but America can be. And I think this song gives us an opportunity to think about America in that way, and also to pay homage to the people who have been on that journey in creating the nation as it is. And if you think back to some of the aspects that I talked about in the presentation, it was African American women who played such a critical role in holding on to this song and then enabling it to move forward. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because African American women are so associated with the children and with the community as a whole. But this is something, as people were experiencing all of the aspects of what Logan talked about in terms of the nadir, this was something to hold on to and to give hope to. Now, my husband was born in Arkansas during the time in which African American kids did not go to school with whites. Schools were legally segregated. And in the school that he went to, this was the song that was sung in the morning activities. As the school began its activities, they would sing, lift every voice and sing. And part of that was the idea of hope, endurance, continuing the fight, because they knew what they were up against. And they knew that they needed to have the strength to continue the fight. And so that's, I think, what they did. Robin, you've got a question.
Thank you. How nationwide was the National Association of the Colored Women's Clubs, and were they political?
Well, they were primarily on the East Coast, but it was a national organization, and so in particular places throughout the country, they were located. And political in the sense of being aware of issues that were occurring throughout the country and communicating information to people in various places throughout the country. It was a political organization in that sense, but it was more than a political organization. It was an organization of community activists who were working to improve the lot of the people in their community. Now, one of the things that they wanted to do is to make sure that when there were opportunities for African Americans in one city or another city, that information could be shared. When individuals were moving from one place to another and they needed to have mentors or supporters, that names of individuals could be identified that they would be able to work with. And so in that sense, it was more of a community support and basic community organization, but they were clearly aware of issues from a political perspective and did voice perspectives on those issues.
Thank you.
There's some questions in the chat that I'll read. If Gerald Donaldson would like to know, Professor, if you do this presentation often to schools or PTAs or other groups like this.
No, I do not. This is not something that I do. This is something, as I said, opening the presentation, this song has a real place in my heart. And a friend of mine and I were talking about Lift Every Voice and Sing, and she also loved this song as much as I did. And we were just talking about, kind of gathering some information about it. And so I started doing some research. I learned an awful lot about it, about James Weldon and Rosamond Johnson that I did not know. And so it was a kind of a activity of the heart for me, but it's not really a research area, and it's not something that I would consider myself an expert in.
I would disagree with that, but you sound like an expert. Yeah, a labor of love. I can see that. There's some other questions here in the chat that I'll read here. When it is performed before an event, is it appropriate to stand?
Always.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Hey, yeah. And I noticed that the last couple of Super Bowls, it's been played since I've been aware of this song. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I had a question, Bruce. I'm not sure quite how to word it because I've been thinking about it, and the times that I've heard this song, and I've learned a lot tonight about things that I didn't know in terms of the history and so forth. But the words of the song that have really been inspirational for me, almost to the point of becoming very emotional, is where it says, "Let us march on to victory is won." I mean, the other words, I don't remember those, but those words, they just stay with me. And I started thinking about, what you're talking about with the information you shared with us this evening. And a lot of it has to do with history. Okay. Like you were saying. And I'm just wondering, can you really understand the meaning of the song if you don't know the history? And so the question that comes, maybe it's a two-part question, but the other part I say is, I just want to get your personal thoughts about ethnic studies and being a requirement in schools as opposed to an elective.
Well, I think the words to the song are very powerful. And there's, for me, as a child learning the words. I didn't know the history as a child. My grandmother did, but I didn't. And I was deeply touched. And so I think that there's definitely a connection that one can make just through the words themselves. In terms of understanding the depth of meaning associated with a song, I think clearly the more you know, the better off you are. And it just adds so much more to your understanding when you realize what had to take place in order for the song to be written. And that, you know, the place where it was written, Jacksonville, Florida, had the community, the African-American community there itself had been destroyed. And 10,000 people left homeless. And that is where the song was created. And then out of that, the ashes of that, the people turned to the song itself to, you know, inspire themselves to continue in the depths of, I'm sure, very difficult circumstances. Now, in terms of ethnic studies, you know, I am of the opinion that ethnic studies is a very important element in our curriculum. And it's something that I think everyone should be exposed to because I think it's American history. I think it's it gives people an understanding of who we are as a nation. And just like you take American history that doesn't necessarily include that full scope, broaden it out and allow for people to have an even deeper understanding of who we are as a people. So that's, you know, that would be my position.
Thank you.
Robert Porter has his hand up. So Robert, if you're unmuted, go ahead and ask.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to say that I was 13 when we came up here from California in Seattle, I mean, and I attended Roosevelt eventually, and I never experienced anything of the Black community, even in Seattle. Of course, had zero knowledge of what the South was like. Until much later, I got a job teaching in Kansas, and this was in 1964. Some of the kids wanted to go to Mississippi to do voter registration, and we were placed in Macomb. Later, I found out that was a Klan headquarters, that we were housed in Black homes in the periphery of town. Very interesting experience there. That was the beginning of my experience with the Black community. From Kansas, I went to university in Houston. The first person I met on campus was a wonderful Black woman with a wonderful smile, who was very active in education on the government's act at that time. And she taught me a good deal of how wonderful it was to be herself. And then her daughters were Felicia Rashad and Debbie Allen.
Oh.
I got to know them as teenagers, and much less delighted in what they did themselves in New York. And eventually Vivian moved to New York herself. And after I worked overseas for a while in Germany and then in Sri Lanka, I came back to the church that I had attended briefly in musical programs in after the war. And I found that in this church in the north end of Ballard, they loved to sing this hymn. They lift every voice and sing. And I was quite amazed that it is the congregation there loves this hymn, and we sing it at almost every important occasion for the Black community. End of disquisition.
Great.
Joe, did you have a question?
No, I had gone ahead and I already asked it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
It's interesting history, Robert. Thank you. One thing I noticed when you played this for the first time today, and I didn't notice it in the other times that I've heard it, it's always been kind of this angelic church-like hymn. I mean, but the first three notes was almost a blues ragtime I was hearing. You know, it was, I just heard that for the first time. I mean, it's a remarkable song.
It is.
You know, it's beautiful. You know, it should be a national hymn. You know, it's just up there with America the Beautiful and all of that.
Bruce, I got a question.
Tony, speak.
Wonderful presentation. I apologize, I got here a little bit late tonight, but there was so much history and parts of history that I didn't know before. And this a little bit like Robin's question. You on the slide there was Black sororities and Black fraternities who are active, and I don't know much about that at all. I want, you know, those are both diminished generally, I think, their role in our society, but I wonder what, if you could talk a little bit more about the role of that. I think Joe Hunter might be in one of those, if I'm not wrong, yeah. And maybe some others at Rare. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about them and their role historically and today.
Well, they have played an incredibly important role. Alpha Kappa Alpha, which is the sorority that our vice president is a member of, Vice President of the United States, and I'm also a member of that sorority. My daughters are also members of that sorority. Is the oldest African-American sorority in the country. Yeah. And the sororities and fraternities were almost always focused in terms of the kind of early work that was done on service to the community. And this notion of, to those who have been given much is expected, was built into the sororities and the fraternities. And so part of what you learned as a member of a fraternity or the sorority was to take advantage of the opportunities that you had before you, but not forget others who perhaps didn't have those same opportunities. And so this notion of lifting as you climb was very much a part of what we did. And even today here in Seattle, all of the sororities and fraternities that I listed on that sheet that were started at the turn of the 20th century are active today at the University of Washington, graduate chapters in the greater Seattle city, and literally all across the country. And service is at the heart of the work that they do, lifting up the community.
I was going to add to that, Tony, and as you know, I'm an Alpha, the Alpha Phi Alpha. So when you talk about Martin Luther King and Thurgood Marshall, when you look in Seattle in terms of those that are in position of leadership, it's an Alpha. So I just say that with a sense of pride. But you know, if you were to look in, you know, just like we had talked about some meetings ago, where the Rotary Club. In terms of the white community, the Rotary Club is a club that has political weight, and can get things done because of the members in that club. I would tell you that it's and they like to say the churches, and it is the Black churches, but more so, in my opinion, it's the Black fraternities and sororities. That if almost anywhere you want to go in terms of a Black person being in charge or getting things done or whatever, that person is a member of some fraternity or sorority. And that's the network that even after college, especially, the network that's there where you can pick up the phone and you can call this person or that person because of the fact that what you have in common is that you belong to the same fraternity or sorority. It's big. It's great to be an alpha, especially.
Now, Joe, you know I'm going to protest as the wife of a Kappa outside. So I just have to do that. That's, you know, that's my loyalty to Kappa. And my father was a Kappa Alpha Psi too.
My brother-in-law's a Kappa, so I understand. That's okay. It's okay.
Great fraternities. Interestingly, though, it was the Alphas who took the lead in creating the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C.
Oh.
And they were behind raising the funds and pushing forward to having that memorial put in place. And I think that, you know, it would have possibly not been done without the Alphas. But all of the fraternities and sororities participated.
I have a question. Well, not really a question. I want to thank you, Professor Banks, for this presentation. And I'm planning a Juneteenth program. And so you put in my head the great idea that this song should be featured and should be a part of that program because it is our Independence Day celebration. So thank you for that.
Oh, good.
I got a question for Naja Brown. Who are the Q dogs?
Omega Psi Phi.
Right.
Yeah, it's another fraternity. They were small in numbers when I was at the U in the early 70s, but they were powerful. And then, of course, you know, I've got family members who are of the other fraternities, but it's all good. It's all good. But the Q Dogs, I mean, when we used to have them stomp in the Red Square, the Q Dogs used to just dominate. They dominated. And they were most of them were from the California area. So that was like exciting for us from Seattle, right? From the CD. So I just had to put a plug in for them. Omega Psi Phi.
I don't know if you know Spencer Shaw. He's passed away now, but he was a renowned professor in what at that time was the library school. It's now the I school. And Spencer was a Q.
All right. Okay. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
I don't see any more questions in the chat. So anybody else have a comment or question? Well, I'll quote Jim and Mikiko, who wants to express their thank you to Professor Banks for an excellent presentation. And I echo that too. A lot of thank yous coming up in the chat. And, you know, for you to, Professor, to come on and your free time here and join us has really been a pleasure and a wonderful experience. Thank you.
And I want to just thank you on behalf of RARE to, you know, again, like Bruce was saying, thank you for your time and the effort and everything here. You know, I learned a lot. And like I said, I mentioned the most powerful words to me in the song and so forth. But, you know, we appreciate you taking the time and everything and for educating us. And, you know, thank you again on behalf of RARE and the board of directors and all our supporters.
Well, thank you for the invitation. And it was truly a pleasure for me to have an opportunity to meet and interact with all of you. I think that the work that you're doing and the efforts that you're making to kind of focus in on some issues that can help you to grow and to learn is absolutely wonderful. And the fact that you are taking the time out of your schedules to do it, I think is another tribute to you. So I think we all can just kind of pat ourselves on the back and say that we're doing good work, and we just simply have to continue.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. Until victory is won.
Until victory is won. We just have to keep on keeping on.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, again, thanks for everyone else for taking the time in your evening to participate in this open discussion. It is our hope to continue to have presenters like Professor Banks, who will come and educate us so that we walk away with just a little bit more knowledge. Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Joe?
Yes, Bruce.
Yeah, I just wanted to close with the coming attractions here.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bruce.
Before you and Tony close, that on April 25th, educator Tori Hazelton will speak on exclusionary discipline and its harmful effects. Exclusionary discipline, removing kids from the classroom, suspensions. And the data is alarming there. It doesn't do much good. It does a lot of harm. And coming up in May, board members Alan Bergano, Robin Uchida Lang, and current Roosevelt parent Jenny Yu will be leading a discussion on the Asian American experience and address some issues, some of the common stereotypes surrounding Asian Americans and the recent rise in American hate crimes and some other issues too. So that's the next 2 months, and there you go.
Great. Great, Bruce. All right. Okay, again, thanks for everyone's participation and support. And hopefully everyone walked away with just a little bit more knowledge and will help them to further their understanding of this journey that we're on for racial equity. So, okay. Okay, good evening. All right, good night.
Peace.
Peace.